All right, so pleased to announce our last speaker. We will have a panel, but last speaker of the conference. Sad to think about. Kevin Crowston, who
it is sad.
It is sad. Or the official, last but definitely not least, from the official biography, is a distinguished professor of information science at the School of Information Studies at Syracuse, I will mention, received his PhD in information technologies from the Sloan School of Management at MIT. I will mention that because also where I received my PhD. We shared an advisor.
That's true. We're thesis siblings.
That's right. Both worked with Tom Malone. And done a whole bunch of work on peer production for a long time and been very sort of influential in a variety of different areas. I was thinking in terms of I think you were perhaps one of the few people who was, I think, cited in all three of our areas of when we did the literature review on peer production,
cool.
Through the three major areas. Today we'll be focusing on questions of motivation and coordination, which itself touches on both two of our big categories of work, but has also done really fantastic work in terms of both comparative analyses of free and open source software projects, and also producing, helping work to produce data sets that a lot of us have used. So for example, a lot of Charlie's work yesterday took advantage of the flossmold data sets, which he was someone who helped produce. In terms of decided to give me an ungoogleable fact about him, so something not only not in the program, but not anywhere except now in your minds, which is that he played cymbal in marching band in college. And with that,
I just posted it on Wikipedia.
Bang!
Alas.
I made a citation for that. I'm going to remove it unless it's cited.
It's gonna get booted, yeah.
All right, sounds good.
So we'll need for my next icebreaker, I'll need a new ungoogleable fact.
Yeah.
And the space of ungoogleable facts will get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's the transparency Laura was talking about. So one of the great pleasures, well actually it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm happy to have been invited. And one of the privileges of going last is I can try to build off of previous work. And of course, one of the limitations in that is my aging memory, which means I actually may not make all the connections that are there to make. This is a departure from what's in the program. I was sufficiently inspired by the earlier rounds of talks, and especially yesterday's keynote, which was 3 hours worth crammed into one, to try to actually put two different talks together. As was mentioned in that wonderful introduction, a lot of my previous work has actually been more focused on questions around how the work is organized, particularly around how peer production work is coordinated. And so I did want to talk some about that. And then there's the second part, which is focused on this more specific question of motivation. That's actually very selfishly motivated in that this is the paper I'm currently trying to revise, which I need to send a copy actually this evening. So feedback at this exact juncture before I leave for the airport will be extremely useful. So that's the selfish. So that's the selfish reason for wanting to talk about the second part. So just to get started with the discussion around coordination. One of the things I think that's become clear in the presentations up until now is that peer production is actually not a very useful term because it encompasses a lot of different systems with very different kinds of functionality and interaction. So there are a bunch that are what I would call just sharing sites, things like Flickr, where you can upload your pictures, or YouTube for videos, and many other kinds of sites like this where the main goal is for people to be able to share what they've created with others. Somewhat more interesting, perhaps, are sites that are focused around interaction. So things like Reddit, for example, where not only are you sharing news articles or pictures or things like you found, but then there are these long discussions about that. Similarly, with online support groups with the kinds of Q&A, it's kind of interesting that sites like Stack Exchange are so good at this that there are open source projects that have basically given up their user support forums in favor of just having a Stack Exchange site around whatever the particular topic is. So again, this sort of more interactive kind of approach, which is also kind of peer production. And then, perhaps most interestingly, sites that are organized around collaboration, the kinds of maker communities or remix communities that Jeff talked about. So this is a remix community around music where people compose music tracks. Other people can pick them up and add them to their own, so literally remix. This, I think, is Scratch, which Jeff talked about. And as has also become clear, there's a variety of research questions that people have addressed around these. There's some basic ones like who is the crowd, what are the demographics, what kind of skills do they have, why do they contribute? That was the first of Mako's list of questions. What basically are the motivations, and that's what I'm going to pick up in the second half. And then, as I said, most of the work I've been doing has been focused more around how do you actually manage these sorts of deliberative collaborations. So one very interesting piece is how do you deal with unreliable contributors, given that in a lot of these settings people are volunteers and they may or may not actually do what they said that they wanted to do. And very often these are very virtual collaborations with people spread around the world, different kinds of organizations, and so you have this kind of work which spans boundaries, which is of great interest, because a lot of companies are actually finding themselves doing that as well. So what I want to do very quickly in the first portion of my talk is just run through some ideas I had about how to look at coordination in peer production. And to do that, I'm going to draw, as you will probably not be surprised to hear, on coordination theory, which is something that Tom Malone and I came up with, actually mostly Tom. So the basic idea here is to define coordination as managing dependencies, and then to start systematically examining what kinds of dependencies exist in the setting you're looking at. And the way we do that is by considering basically just two categories of things in the world. So tasks, work that's being done, and actors or resources that are needed to do those tasks. So it's a little bit reductionist in the sense that we view the actors as just another kind of resource. That was the Brave New World, no, sorry, the 1984 version from Laura's talk. But then that gives you a set of different kinds of patterns of dependencies. So it could be that you need some resource in order to do a task. So some kind of inputs, someone to work on it, and so on. Could be that you have multiple tasks that work together to create some kind of an output, in which case there has to be some way of integrating those, which is actually just another task in itself, but also constraints on how the task can be done. Very, very typical kind of dependency pattern is producer-consumer. A task creates something that then gets used by another task. And shared input resources, so single resource that is being shared across multiple tasks. And the point is twofold. First is that the existence of these dependencies constrains how the work can be done. So if you have a situation like this, these tasks can't be done just any old way. They have to be done in a way that they will fit together into the shared output. If you have this kind of a flow dependency, then there has to be some way to ensure that this resource that's getting created is actually what the final task wants. And that can be done in a variety of ways, which is the second point about coordination theory, is that given these dependencies, you have to do something to manage them. And very often there's a selection of different kinds of coordination mechanisms that could be used for that. So if you take the last one, for example, shared input resource, where you have a particular resource, you have to decide which task is going to get it. This sort of really, really old distinction between market and hierarchy is essentially the answer to that question. The resource could be auctioned off in a market to the highest bidder, or it can be allocated by a manager in some kind of a hierarchy. And you can think of lots of intermediaries in between as well. So,
Excuse me, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Often in coordination theory, there's reciprocal interdependence, two-way arrows.
That's because the sort of classical view of coordination analyzes it between actors and says, I'm dependent on you because you're going to give me some input, in which case there can also be the reciprocal dependency of we're sharing something and it's going to go back and forth. Mm-hmm. And so what's a little different in this context is we actually push the analysis down a level to say the reason that you and I might be interdependent is because we share some kind of resource. And in that case, you can decompose the way that we use the resources as, I get it from you or I give it to you. And then those reciprocal dependencies turn out to be sort of these back and forths. I give you something, you do something, you give it back. Or perhaps they're that kind of a shared output where we're both creating something. So this view is a little bit different than the typical view in organization science, in the sense that it puts the stuff, the resources into the picture, as opposed to simply focusing on the pattern of relationships between people. And actually, part of the argument for why we propose this is that it does allow you to unpack some of those relationships. And also, by focusing on people and tasks separately, it lets you examine the implications of reassigning work. So if I simply say, oh, well, you and I are mutually interdependent, that's kind of the end of the story. If I say, well, the task you're doing requires an input from a task I'm doing, we can then say, well, so what would happen if you simply did both tasks? Maybe that would be the better way to solve that particular interdependency is, just to move the tasks around the people who are doing them as opposed to moving the people around and hoping that that's going to solve things. Right, so I think I already said this. Different kinds of coordination mechanisms. And if we then start drawing the patterns of tasks and resources, we get these pictures like this for sharing. Basically, you have people doing a bunch of tasks like taking pictures, creating photos, and just making them available to people. So very limited kinds of interdependencies. You don't really have to interact to try to solve any of those things. It's just, I took a picture, and it's available if you want it. With the interacting, it's a little bit more complicated because we're creating this common output, for example, the Q&A page. And so there's some interaction between me posting a question, you posting a possible answer to it, someone else posting a different answer to it. And so those things are all contributing to building up this common output, the question and answer page. And so there are some dependencies there in the sense that your contribution has to fit with what other people are doing. This is why we have moderation systems where we can, for example, delete messages that are thought to be irrelevant or spam or what have you. But again, not a very sophisticated kind of coordination that's needed. Right, so the shared output dependency. And then lastly, with the collaborating, we might have these more complicated pictures where you've created something, and that's kind of a dead end. You've created something which then I took and remixed. Maybe someone else has created something which has been remixed. And if you extend this out, you get the kind of pictures that Jeff was drawing with many, many iterations of the design, lots of different kinds of steps that people have done to evolve those. So we can now apply this to a couple of different kinds of peer production and see what we get. One that I've spent a lot of time studying is citizen science, things like eBird. Are there any birders in the room? Few birders, right. So, sorry? You're an eBirder. You observe observations, right. So the point about eBird is that it's a way that birders can record the birds that they saw. It turns out that many birders do this anyway. They keep lists of what birds they saw on a particular trip, or they saw in a particular location, or what have you. There's a lot of pride in people's life lists. When a rare bird is spotted, there are systems that will announce that so that people can then converge on the particular nature reserve in hopes to see the same bird. So this basically takes that motivation to want to record this information, and it has people submit them online, creates this enormously huge database of bird sightings. With some very sophisticated math, you can then turn that into incidence maps. And it's been used, for example, to develop global range maps. You can actually see where the birds are at different times of the year. But also things like predicting the impact of the Gulf oil spill by looking at what birds are in the area that's likely to be hit by the oil. And the data is sufficiently good. It was used as the basis for the State of the Birds report. You might not know, but the US government every year puts out a State of the Birds report talking about how the birds are doing. And in terms of the coordination model, part of this is actually fairly simple, right? We have birders who are watching birds. They create bird sightings. And all we've done is on top of that layered this common database where all of those sightings can be pulled together for ornithological research. But the advantage of looking at it this way is we realize that there's now going to be this usability dependency. How do we make sure that the bird sightings are useful for ornithological research? And it turns out that that's actually the real contribution of eBird that you can't see because it happens behind the scene, is a very sophisticated set of math for turning observations into incidents. a lot of filtering, so that if you report something which is quite unusual, it gets flagged as being, that's kind of strange. And then a bunch of humans who will actually go through and say, OK, so here's this sighting which seems a little bit unusual. Let's follow up. And so they'll actually call you up and say, Darren, are you sure that you saw an ivory-billed woodpecker? Because they're extinct. And then, if you have a photo, or some other information, then maybe they will take that. Another kind of citizen science project, which has already been discussed, is Galaxy Zoo, because in a lot of sciences, the problem isn't getting the data, it's having too much data and not being able to deal with it all. And so, so things like astronomy, someone mentioned, literally terabytes of data, soon to be petabytes of data every night. And so some of this can be analyzed automatically. Some of it does require human judgment to assess, so things like Galaxy Zoo. And just skipping forward, one of the neat side effects of having humans look at all the images is that they occasionally spot things like this green blob over here. At the time it was seen was very unknown. It now appears to be a Quasar Echo. It's basically the most powerful visible object in the universe. And it was discovered, it's named Hanny's Voorwerp, after Hanny van Arkel, who's a Dutch school teacher who's the one who discovered it. She was the first one who actually saw the thing on a Galaxy Zoo image and said, hey, what's that? And it was the astronomers who actually worked out what it was, but it's named after her, and she's one of the authors on the paper. And again, the coordination model is very much like what we saw before. The only difference is that because we have that usability dependency, and we can't validate, we have an opportunity to do something in Zooniverse which you can't do in bird sighting, which is we can have multiple people look at the same image. So that's what's going on down here. You have multiple zooites looking at the same image. You develop a consensus. And so that's how you can ensure that the data are usable for research, is basically some kind of consensus model. But the neat thing is that every now and again, there's a Hanny who discovers something unexpected, and that leads to a different kind of research. And this is actually something that my group has done some work on, which I, in the interest of time, will not talk about, except that we had robots. A very different kind of citizen science project is represented by Foldit. So in this case, the goal is to figure out the folding strategy of proteins. I think many people here are probably familiar with Foldit. It's kind of neat in that a group of Foldit players solved the structure of the simian SIV virus, which is something that the scientists have been working on for years, and they were able to do it in 3 weeks. So there are lots of those. And this actually, again, has a slightly different pattern in the sense that we have lots of people working on problems, but we actually don't care about most of their solutions. What we care about is the right solution, the best solution. And generally speaking, there's a few people who are really good at it, and they're the ones who figure it out. And pretty much everybody else's you can ignore. However, there is theoretical reasons to believe that having multiple inputs will lead to a better solution. And one of the things I'm not showing here is that Foldit actually does support interactions between people. So someone can do a partial solution and share it. Other people can build on that partial solution. So in that regard, it looks a little bit more like the remix communities than it does strictly like this. But again, you can see that these pictures are telling us that there's something different going on in Foldit than there was in Zooniverse. Of course, a lot of people, including myself, are interested in things like Wikipedia, which almost needs no introduction, or open source software, which again needs almost no introduction, except to notice that these are, in fact, peer production in the sense that we have all these individual contributions, bits of code like Laura was showing. My group has studied lots of things around floss work practices. I had a long list in an earlier slide, which I left out. The thing is that the dependency structure here is really, really different because the unit that we're building are these code or these articles, and they themselves have dependencies amongst them. So one unit of code may depend on another. That's the problem that Laura was talking about. That, if someone changes the library you're depending on, then that can have a lot of impacts for the code that you're writing. And the tasks are also very different. So, updating a particular module, fixing a bug, what have you, we have, instead of the structure in a lot of the citizen science projects of millions of identical tasks, we have hundreds or dozens of very different kinds of tasks. And we also have this usability dependency that at the end of the day, the code that we're writing has to be useful for some user who's going to actually use this thing. So as you can see, the picture looks pretty much entirely different from the stuff we've been talking about before. We also have these interesting problems where someone may say that they're going to fix a bug and then just never do it. So we have to have systems that can deal with those sorts of unreliable contributors. And so we end up with a very different pattern of dependencies. So these resource dependencies between modules of code, shared output dependencies where the patches that people are creating actually have to fit together. If one person changes a line of code, someone else makes a different change, that's a problem. We have to work out how to deal with task assignment. Multiple people may want to work on the same task, and as I said, this usability dependency. And in open source, you can actually identify the kinds of mechanisms that people have created to deal with those. So shared output dependencies, we have all of these source code control systems that help us to manage those. Usability is actually quite different. It's one of the big complaints about open source is that with the exception of some very large projects like Firefox, mostly projects can't really afford usability experts. And instead, the programmers are sort of proxying for the users. And the problem, of course, is that programmers are really bad proxies for users. And so you end up with software that programmers love and which users may find a little bit difficult. We see, in terms of task actor, a lot of use of self-assignment. So we let people decide for themselves what to work on. Actually, a lot of companies are now starting to do this as well. So it's not quite as sharp of a distinction as it used to be. But rather than having a manager say, OK, there's a bug in this unit of code, Nosh, you're responsible for that. You go fix it. And the really interesting thing is about code interdependencies. So we have these interdependencies between code. And you would think that that would mean that the developers would have to spend a lot of time talking to each other. I'm going to fix this. How's that going to impact you? And Laura's talk suggested that there was some exploration of that. But in fact, when we analyzed the email chats, we didn't really see a lot of discussion about the code. And so one theory is that it's implicit coordination. The developers have really good mental models of the code. They know what everyone else is working on. They know what's likely to be problematic. Our alternative explanation, and actually that's probably right. There's probably at least a little bit of that. But our explanation is actually very much related to the transparency argument that Laura was providing, that basically the traces of work themselves provide the information that the developers need to coordinate. And so that's a kind of coordination called stigmergic coordination, coordination through signs in the environment. It was actually invented to explain how ants coordinate, because unlike bees, ants don't talk to each other. Instead, when an ant finds some food, it leaves a trail of pheromone. And then that change in the environment triggers other ants to follow the trail to get the food and come back. And so similarly, as the developers are changing the code, they're leaving traces in the code that are then visible to other developers, which causes them to change their behavior. So the developers actually don't need to talk to each other in a very detailed level about what they're doing, because they can just look at the code, which is something that seems to work quite well in open source. The question is, could you then generalize this to look at other kinds of things? And I think this kind of transparency work, making the work transparent, is part of the answer. There's also the flip side of it, is that developers know how to read those signs. And so part of the interesting question is, what does it mean to be able to read the signs of work and to use those as good input for coordination? So what is it that developers know to look for when they're looking at someone else's code? How could you make those sorts of signs visible in other work and train people to be aware of them? Plus, there's a bunch of work practices that are quite important. So one of the things Laura mentioned was the idea of having a certain size of check-in where you don't dump thousands of lines of code on other people. Part of the reason that's important is that thousands of lines of code are not readable. They do not provide input for coordination because you can't make sense of them. So having these units of code that someone can look at and understand what you did, even if they don't have to read every line, is quite important. Anyway, so that's a little bit about coordination. In the second part of my talk, I want to switch very quickly to motivation. And you can see this is a different background, because this is, in fact, the second hour of my talk. And this is looking at this problem of why people contribute user-generated content. And we have this long list of the kinds of things that people generate. There's certainly been lots of research about this. This is, in fact, one of the most researched topics in the early stages of open source, mostly by economists who are very puzzled, as Meiko mentioned, or actually Aaron mentioned. So one is just this very simple cost-benefit model. The cost is the opportunity cost of the time. The benefit are things like future job offers, ego gratification, the working code itself. So you end up with these expectancy models. That I think that if I contribute, then I'll get a better job, and I make this sort of cost benefit. The surveys people have done don't really support that, because you'll notice that, for example, a lot of people really emphasize building human capital, so open source is a way to learn, or the fact of self-determination. I like programming. My boss tells me to program boring things. This is a chance where I can actually program interesting things on my own time. So the sort of serious work kind of idea. And things like self-marketing is actually fairly low, except for people who are actually being paid by it. This was, I should have put the citation on here. This was a survey that was done some years ago. There has been some research on motivation in Wikipedia, and I probably need to update this because I think there's been some more since I put the slide together. And again, it emphasizes things like self-determination, altruism, but also community identification, and not things like getting a better job. People don't do Wikipedia to prove to potential employers that they can write encyclopedia articles. And actually, interesting, not personal need for the system. Because almost by definition, if you're competent to write a Wikipedia article, you don't need it. So it's very different than the kind of use value you get out of a piece of working software. So those kinds of things that seem like they're important in open source maybe don't work quite so well in FLOSS. Our observation, though, was that there's some opportunities for a somewhat richer model. And the most important thing is that one of the things we learned in open source is that there's a lot of different roles that people take on in projects. And a very common model is this onion model, where you have a small number of core developers at the center who contribute a lot, who really know each other, a smaller number of co-developers who maybe contribute patches or occasional bug fixes, a bunch of active users who might be involved in the mailing list, answer questions, report bug reports, or ask for features but not code. And then the very, very large number of passive users who just use the code. And you could make the same kind of argument in Wikipedia. Most articles, there's a small number of people who are heavily involved in editing, who really view it as their article. There's all of the rest of us who maybe occasionally read the article but don't really leave any traces. To think that the motivation for all of these people is the same seems a little simplistic. It seems like people might have very, very different motivations, and so that was part of the goal. So we have two innovations in our model. First is we actually explicitly take into account that people may move through different stages of participation in the project and have different motivations at those different stages. And secondly, rather than relying on an economic model of cost-benefit, we viewed volunteering as a kind of helping behavior, and drew on a framework from Schwartz and Howard that was originally describing why someone might come to the aid of someone who's being mugged or not come to the aid. But basically, this set of stages of recognizing a need, having feelings of obligation, making a positive evaluation. So it's not just cost-benefit, but these other stages as well. So the initial stage is just curiosity. In order to get involved in the project, you have to take that first step of saying, so what is this Wikipedia? Can someone really edit it? And we came up with this very complicated list of motives, which I won't go through. But basically, the idea that you have to see that the project exists. You have to think that you could actually do it. But the main argument we made was that at this stage, the perceived benefit was almost certainly just curiosity. What is this Wikipedia, and what can you do about it? And that's quite different from the next stage of sustained contribution, where it seems like the motivation is much more around the work itself, finding it interesting, feeling like you're becoming part of the community, feeling like you're actually making a difference in the world. And so again, we have this complicated thing, which I'm not going to show the details because I have some hypotheses coming up. And then our third stage was meta-contribution, which is people who have moved from doing the work itself to doing things that support the work. So in a open source, becoming a project leader, joining the foundation, helping to deal with legal issues, resolving disputes. in Wikipedia, all the maintainers, admins, sysops, and so on. So people who make it better for editors, but who are not necessarily writing the articles themselves. They're doing all of the back work that's necessary for this large community to be successful. And we argued there that this is much more likely to be due to the sort of altruistic and kind of helping behaviors, but also importantly, identification with the group, that you actually stop thinking about improving Wikipedia article by article, and you think about improving Wikipedia as a community. How do we make the wiki community a stronger community? So that was meta contribution. And again, whoops. I don't know what that was. So part of this here, we were actually looking at social movements. Viewing Wikipedia as a social movement. What are some of the rewards people get for being in a social movement? And again, we have this set of propositions, which I'm happy to share. But I want to save time to talk about how we actually tested this model. Ta-da. So we actually struggled. We wanted to do a survey. It was hard to convince people that another survey about motivation was a good idea, because basically it's been studied to death. We were arguing that, that this was really going to be different, because we had these different stages. But part of the stages was non-contributors, which it turns out it's really hard to survey. So there were a lot of logistical details. So what we've done instead is draw on data from a survey that the Wikimedia Foundation actually ran in April of 2011 on the Wikimedia editors. They asked a bunch of questions, 60 some odd questions, 70 questions. So in that data set, we were able to classify users by how much they contributed and what kind of access they had. So we basically said anyone who reported fewer than 10 edits was still in this initial stage. There were 413 of them. Anyone who had a higher access level, like admin and so on, we called a meta contributor, 666 of those, probably just a coincidence, 666. And then the other 4,000 people were what we called sustained contributors. So they were contributing more regularly, but they didn't have these higher levels of access. We reframed all the propositions as hypotheses about the differences either between initial and sustained, and between sustained and meta contributors, and then tested it with the logistics regression. So it led to hypotheses like the perceived need for contributions will be higher in sustained contributors. So we hypothesize that initial contributors are basically just curious, but people who actually view the Wikipedia as having needs for contributions, that will more likely make them a sustained contributor. And so we have questions like, I saw an error and I wanted to fix it. I keep finding or looking for mistakes. I find articles that are incomplete or biased. Domain expertise is part of, you're thinking that you can fix it. It turns out that one of the most commonly cited reasons for not contributing to Wikipedia is that, there doesn't seem to be something that you know about that you can contribute to. And so, again, we had some questions from the survey about that. We included computer self-efficacy, that you actually know how to use your computer, because that's a precondition for contributing. Agreement with project's goals. There were 2 questions there that people edit because they believe information should be freely available, and they like the philosophy of openness and collaboration. Time, as I said before, time is one of the biggest reasons that people give for not editing. The questionnaire didn't really ask about those things, but it did ask some demographics that might suggest. So whether somebody was in school, whether they were employed, whether they have kids. Curiosity, there's this very nice question. Why did you start editing? I wanted to see if anyone could edit. So that seemed like it measured curiosity. And then positive and negative feedback. So we hypothesized that positive feedback would make people more likely to be a sustained editor. Negative feedback would make them less likely. And again, there's a bunch of questions about the kind of interactions people have. So forgive the next slide. It's very dense. But basically, it's a logistics regression. So it gives the increase in the odds of, in this case, being a sustained contributor rather than initial with those variables I mentioned. And so you can see that we had 4 things for H1. One of them is significant. The other ones aren't. H2, having expertise, is significant. Computer efficacy wasn't. Interestingly, H4 was not supported. So agreeing with Wikipedia philosophy did not make it more likely that you'd be a sustained contributor. However, not being in school did increase it. Being single did increase it. Being curious was associated with a really much lower chance that you'd be a sustained contributor. So if you reported that that's why you started, it was much less likely that you would continue to be a sustained contributor. Good feedback. That's not a typo. 36,000% more likely to be a sustained contributor if you had gotten good feedback. That might be spurious. It might be that you only get feedback if you've been an editor for a while.
By good, do you mean solid feedback?
No,
Or do you mean
sorry, positive feedback. I should have said positive. Positive feedback and negative feedback. Interestingly, getting negative feedback was also associated with a higher chance of being a sustained contributor. So again, that might be spurious. It might just be that you don't get negative feedback if you are an initial contributor because you're not on long enough to do anything. So, so teasing those things out and actually trying to get feedback in the last 6 months versus feedback in all time.
Just very quickly, how should we be interpreting the percentage increase? This is a nonlinear model, so where is the percentage increase?
No, it's a logistics model,
Odds ratio.
and so it's the odds ratio.
It's the percentage of the odds.
So it's just the coefficient as an odds ratio.
Correct. And it's a 0-1 outcome. Being in the initial group versus being in the sustained group. And like I said, because it's a cross-sectional survey, causality is hard to tease out. We really struggled with how to take our ideas about what might be different between initial and sustained contributors and put it into something you could actually test statistically. So if people have better ideas about how to do that I can implement on the flight home, I would really, really appreciate hearing those.
Well, I would break some of the data down into percentiles and look at the odds across percentiles.
So I'm sorry, percentiles, break it down, percentiles of?
Take a variable, break it down into its percentiles, so bin the data, and then look at the odds within the bins. Because 36,000% increase is really, really big, and I'm sure that's happening probably in just a small section of the data.
So bin it by number of contributions, perhaps.
It could be that, you could play with a lot of different types of binning, but that would be the best way to show these results.
Right. OK.
Look under something like margins plot or margins, and you'll
Modulus plot.
margins.
Oh, margins plot.
Margins, sorry, man.
OK.
But yeah, that would really,
OK.
that would be great.
We did have some of these demographics that were in there. Age was not related to being initial versus sustained. Having a doctorate or a master's was related. Being female was a 60% decrease in likelihood, which has been commented on already that these sorts of peer production communities don't seem very welcoming to women. So that's evidence without really being much of an explanation. Some of these things here, like being assigned to edit or having professional reasons, were related with being less likely, which again speaks to the importance of internal motivations as opposed to extrinsic motivations. Being told to edit Wikipedia doesn't necessarily translate into doing it continuously. And one actually which we did not include in our models, but which seems important, is that many people reported that it was just fun. And so continuing because it was fun was related with continuing. So again, that's the intrinsic motivation. The next slide is sustained versus meta-contributors. So interestingly, seeing that there's a need for articles makes it less likely that you'll be a meta-contributor. So that is very highly related to being a sustained contributor, similarly with expertise. This is where the Wikipedia philosophy actually was significant. So being a meta-contributor was related to beliefs about the Wikipedia philosophy. So it's a little unclear how to interpret that. Does that mean that these sort of philosophical reasons aren't actually motives to be a sustained contributor? That's one possibility. Another possibility is that, in fact, it's as important for initial as it is for sustained. So there's some puzzles here to try to unpack a little bit. Time was the same between sustained and meta, which is actually sensible. And good feedback and bad feedback were both, again, positive impacts on being a meta contributor. Age was a slight negative one. Education was quite important, as you can see. And again, this one, continuing to gain reputation, became important for the meta contributors. So again, that's kind of evidence that it's the meta contributors who really feel like they're part of a community where the input from the community matters, and that might not be as important as we thought for the sustained contributors. So to leave some time for discussion, I'm going to skip through what I just said. I think there are some practical implications, like if you're in the early stages of a project, making the project visible so you get lots of initial contributors is really important. Reducing the barriers to entry. So that was the study that Aaron and Mako were reporting on, that just the slightest increase in barriers to entry seems like it decreases that initial contribution. It's been said by other people, but this seems to corroborate the fact that positive feedback is important, or actually any kind of feedback, just making people know that their contributions have been received and accepted. For sustained contributors, having continual opportunities to contribute seems important. The model suggests that making tasks seem meaningful is important. Actually, we don't have data on that, so that's not a conclusion of the data. And for meta contributors, it seems like one way you can reward sustained contributors is providing these different kinds of tasks that they can move into, where they have increased responsibility and visibility, and they feel like they're part of the community. And there are also, I think, some implications for studying peer production. One is just to be very aware of the role of the participants. There are a lot of studies where you sort of average across thousands of people, and if 900 of them are people who tried it and didn't continue, and you're averaging that with the 90 who are sustained contributors and the 10 who are meta contributors, it's not going to be a very meaningful average. So I think really like filtering out people who are not, who tried it out and who didn't continue is quite important. So what that suggests is for a lot of these studies, you really want to try to focus on the small percentage of people who are doing the bulk of the work, because that's in a sense the interesting part of the population to study. And also, I think separating out contribution from meta contribution is interesting. So actually trying to get a handle on the people who are going above and beyond the main task of the peer production community to doing some of these other things, and studying them as a separate population is probably important. So like I said, so one of the things we want to do is to try to look at the role of meta contribution in making the work easier, and to see whether or not that actually works, in the sense that when meta contribution goes up in one time period, you can see contributions going up in another time period. We tested this with Wikipedia. Does it work for other things? Like there's all of these massive online games. Could you apply this in that setting as well? It does seem like, for example, in World of Warcraft, there are people who take on the role of team leaders and who organize raids and do a lot of that kind of meta work. So maybe they're more like the meta contributors. As I said, there's this problem that people have pointed out about so few women taking part in these. The data that we have seems to corroborate that, but unpacking what's going on, what are the specific factors? This seems to suggest that women are filtering out before they become sustained contributors, because there was an effect of gender between sustained and meta. But exactly where in that process, I still don't know. All right, so with that, why don't I stop, because I would like to leave a little time for questions.
Thanks, Kevin. Mine's actually partly a question, partly an invitation, because I know that there's someone else in the room who has done some really interesting research on the difference in motivations and attitudes towards altruism related to different kinds of contributors to Wikipedia. And I'm kind of curious, I don't know, Jerome, do you mind explaining a little bit about what you found in that study, and then maybe we could hear what Kevin thinks about it with regard to his work?
Yeah. So thank you for this terrific presentation. I totally relate to the distinctions you made. What I've been doing was a bit different, but with kind of the same goal, and I ran the study at the exact same time the Wikimedia editor survey ran. So it's interesting, and I did that actually with Yochai and Mayo in the room. And Aaron and Mako also helped me out quite a bit with this. So what I did is run a game theoretical scenario to identify the motivations of those Wikipedians, and basically running a horse race between altruistic motives, reciprocity motives, and also social image. So those are the three motivations on which we focused in this study. And what you actually see happening is a dynamic that's precisely related to the one you talk about. Is you really need to distinguish between initial contributors, those that come from being a non-contributor to being a sustained contributor, and then those who go on as super contributors, so to speak. And the motivations of those two types of contributors are really, really different.
Okay.
And what you actually see happening is that in the group of non to becoming sustained contributor, altruistic and reciprocity motives, experimentally measures by very abstract protocols in experimental economics, actually predict very well that trajectory. So it's reciprocity and altruism.
Right.
Because that prediction becomes...
Yeah, from a non-contributor to being a somewhat sustained contributor. So we're talking about 0 to maybe 1,000 to 2,008. So that's already pretty substantial.
Right.
So
yeah,
that's
1,000 is a lot.
Yeah, that's already a lot. So in that range, altruistic motives and reciprocity. But then when you move to doing more than that, then those two motivations don't play a role anymore. And then it's really social image taking on very, very, very strongly.
And feeling like you're part of the community and that you have something to demonstrate to the community.
That's right. So you feel an identification, and there is something that you need to show to the people out there about yourself, whatever that is.
Yep.
And this really what makes you become one of those super contributors that does that meter work, in a sense.
Well, super contributors could just be people who edit a lot without doing the meta work, but I suspect it would be more or less the same for people who switch to meta also. So
that's kind of correlated.
And in fact, so what it's making me realize is that here I was just focusing on the difference between the groups, but looking at what's related to, as you said, sort of a low level of sustained contributor versus a super contributor would also be interesting. And with this data, we might be able to pull out some of that as well. And I totally buy your argument about the shift from sort of altruistic and reciprocity to the group identification. The questionnaire, unfortunately, does not have quite enough questions for us to really tease out who feels those sorts of, actually either altruism, because they unhelpfully did not include a personality profile on the survey. And also the group identification. There's a few things that you might think of as proxies for that I want to look at. So it seems like the data that you are able to collect is richer in some ways, but also quite complementary to the findings here. So that's interesting.
Yeah, in a sense, it considers less motivation, so it's less rich in that sense.
Right. But it's a different set of motivations.
Right, and it's richer in the sense that it's identified in like very abstract game theoretical scenarios, like people basically playing public goods games online without being aware that this is going to be correlated with their activity in the site in whatever way. And actually, you find that the behavior of those people in this abstract public goods game, dictator game, trust games, you name it, predicts their trajectory.
Okay, so that's actually very cool.
So, yeah, but what you did is really cool too, and I'm pretty reassured by the fact that actually when you look at this data, it's a very, very cool idea that you had. The findings are pretty much aligned. This is pretty much the same story that we're telling, so that's reassuring.
Right. Okay, good. I should get the citation for that if I don't have it.
Thank you both for humoring me by carrying out the conversation.
So I wanted to unpack or just make a comment on sort of the finding about the gender finding, because I think that's something that we've sort of elided in a lot of our conversations here about sort of the emancipatory potential of these sorts of common-based peer production, that when you begin to look at these systems, whether it's Wikipedia or Floss or even like Scratch, you see it's like 80% male, right? And so there's ways.
Open source is, I think the last estimate I saw was 98.5% male.
Right, and so we can say like, well, there's maybe path dependencies there that bake into that, and that reinforces that. But then we are also seeing now in a lot of these sorts of systems, whether it's Twitter and Wikipedia, when you have sorts of initiatives that are trying to sort of like at Wikimedia Foundation, the ADA initiative, and these sorts of things, they're trying to recognize and sort of make interventions and sort of try to tip the scales the other way, that you see sort of very hostile, very toxic reactions to that coming to the forefront. And so as we sort of, so I just wanted to make this as a comment, maybe I'm tipping my hand about what I want to talk about at the panel, but as we think about these sorts of issues of harassment, these issues of inequality and commons-based peer production, should we sort of take that as with the same rose-tinted glasses that Yochai offered, or is there something that we see the reproduction of these sorts of inequalities across all these systems as being some problematic in some way?
We actually did do a proposal to NSF to study gender inequality in open source. The model that we put forward was a variation on the very typical pipeline model with leaks. And our suggestion was that there wasn't a source. It's just that you had this pipeline of things you had to go through to become a core open source developer. And at each of 17 stages, you lost a percentage of the women. But the point was that you did that 17 times. It's like enriching uranium, right? Each step in the enrichment process only adds a % or two, but you just do it 30, 40 times, and there you go. You have pure plutonium. So the policy implication of that is that there isn't an easy fix, right? That if you're losing a % or two at 17 different places, you have to do 17 different things to try to correct it. And that's not the kind of message that policymakers really want. They just want the Band-Aid. Anyway, but yes, I think it will be an interesting discussion at the panel.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm wondering if you saw anything that involves any kind of trade-off. In other words, people might start doing meta tasks, and that might increase their contributions, and that might be a virtuous cycle where people do more meta and they do more contributions. On the other hand, there could be a situation in which there's just so much time, and so they end up doing mostly meta and less task.
Right.
Like, the kind of analogies in academia, people do meta things like organize conferences, and that might mean they can do less papers, but on the other hand, they have graduate students and other colleagues that can do it, and in these open source environments, usually you don't have a hierarchy, so your time is your time.
Yeah, so the data here are just from Wikipedia, and in fact, we don't really, actually, now that I think about it, there are some data on the survey about how people spend their time that I started to look at, but I haven't really completely unpacked. And so one of the questions is whether people are able to sustain both a lot of contribution as well as a lot of meta contribution. But I think what would be quite interesting, and you might actually be able to estimate it by looking at the total volume of work on Wikipedia, is what the multiplier is on meta work. So the hypothesis we have is that people who make these meta contributions make it easier for editors to edit. And if that were true, then there should be some kind of a relationship between the amount of meta work that's being put into the system and the, if you will, the efficiency or effectiveness of the editorial work. So just as an example, if two editors are involved in some kind of an edit war, then that work is not productive. They're doing a bunch of stuff that they're just reverting or writing over. And so someone coming in and mediating that dispute might increase the efficiency such that the editor's edits are actually contributing to a better article. So in principle, you could actually model that by looking at inputs in the form of mediation and the kind of productivity thing that Aaron and Mako were showing. And in fact, another project I'm working on with Nicholas Julian and Felipe Ortega is actually trying to model Wikipedia efficiency using fairly simple production functions. So actually thinking about meta inputs, meta contributions as an input to that could be interesting. So that's something maybe to follow up on.
So So actually following on that, when you were presenting the model before you got into the specifics of this survey, when you were talking about the meta contributors, you actually used the term group identification as a factor that you thought would be a motivator for the meta. Is
that it's hard to be motivated to engage in meta contribution for a group that you don't feel like you're part of.
Well, I was curious because as you were describing, you actually kind of hinted at two things. One is kind of psychological identification or part of the group, and the other was almost a secondary form of awareness of a need. Kind of knowledge that the group has things it needs to do that the individual articles don't. I wasn't sure which one.
So awareness. Well, so in the helping model, there's awareness of need, feeling like you have a capacity to respond, some kind of cost-benefit trade-off of the costs and benefits of responding, and therefore, for meta contributors, you would assume that knowledge of the need for meta contribution would be one of those factors. That if you aren't aware of the fact that Wikipedia needs mediators, then it's unlikely, that would strike you as something to do. There's no data about that on the survey, though. So, but it is interesting that awareness of the needs for edits is actually predictive of being a sustained contributor rather than a meta contributor. So people who say, I see articles that need fixing are more likely to therefore be a sustained contributor. So that part of it, at least, that is happening.
Do we have time for one more? Great.
From you, of course.
Yeah, well, look, I really loved the talk. I thought it was great. And my question is about, if I were to think of this as a sociologist would say that motivations to do things come from basically two big inducements. It's either rational and in my self-interest, so I do it because I got paid, I do it because it gave me status or prestige, I did it because it improved my skills, and then the other really big inducement is I do things because they're normative. They just become taken for granted, the way in which you should do things, and I actually don't think very much about them.
Right.
And I'm curious,
like showing up for class every day.
It could be for showing up for class, it could be, the side of the sidewalk you walk down. There's so many things we do constantly because of this.
Yeah.
Particularly like when we face an environment where we can't figure things out as whether they're going to be rationally good for us or not. Like maybe if I go to Wikipedia, am I actually going to get feedback or not? Maybe I won't. But I have no idea before I actually do it. So normativeness drives a lot of behavior. I'm curious if in your research you've thought at all about how you might measure this idea that it's become normative to work on Wikipedia or do any kind of peer production. And if so, how did you measure it and what were the sorts of things you found?
I have thought about something a little bit different, which is the way that system usage becomes habitual. So normative and habitual aren't exactly the same thing, but there is this notion that you do things without having to think about them consciously. And I notice that mostly when I fall into bad habits like reading Reddit instead of grading papers, because Reddit is a habitual action. So I completely agree with the notion that a lot of the system use is not driven by sort of rational pre-calculation, but more habit or norm. I also think that that's further argument for there being a big difference between initial contribution and sustained contribution, because initial contributors are very unlikely to either have developed the habits or to have adopted the norms. And so they're going to be doing things for an entirely different set of reasons than someone who has gotten into this either habit of editing or has adopted the norms of contributing to Wikipedia. So that's, again, it's not the argument I made for the stages, but it would be an argument for stages. With regard to how you test it, in this study, it's not tested at all because there aren't any questions on the survey about adoption of Wikipedia norms. It's about philosophy instead. There aren't any questions about habit. I think.
Ask questions about how many of your friends have done.
Actually, that is one of the questions on the survey. Is I started editing because my friends edit. I continue editing because my friends edit. Those were not significant predictors in the model. And in fact, I felt a little bit badly about choosing this topic because the theme is supposedly networks, and there is not really a network story in here. But of course, as people have pointed out, Wikipedia is ripe for networks you could harvest. And so with sort of a retrospective analysis of the data set, you could imagine connecting network features to the observed editing behavior. So that would be something to follow up on. The question about friends is not something I think you could get in that particular setting. And anyway, it's not really clear that the friends argument would help too much with the norms. So this question about how people come to know what is the correct way to behave on Wikipedia is actually, I think, something that the Foundation struggles with a little bit, because as Wikipedia has become bigger and more complicated, that set of norms is bigger and more complicated, and it's potentially one of the barriers to entry is that it used to be, well, yeah, it's the editor. In fact, actually, someone has said this. Wikipedia, the encyclopedia, anyone can edit if they're willing to learn the Wikipedia way and the rules and deal with feedback and, da 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 da. So it's not this sort of Wild West of anyone can do anything, because it is so normatively regulated in ways that are very opaque to outsiders. Even me, my edit on Wikipedia got reverted. So.
Thank you.